Never happens. Welcome everybody. My name's David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. It's wonderful to have you all here. Lots of cool things going on. We survived the Maine Sustainability and Water Conference last week. A new record in attendance, I think, and a wonderful keynote by Ron Calhoun. So if you missed it, we'll get it up on the web later, and you can hear it for yourself. So today it's my pleasure to welcome Joe Zydlewski to give a talk. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. Hi, Gail. Joe's a professor in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology here. He's been here since 2004, is that right? And he's also the assistant unit leader of the USGS Maine Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. So he plays those dual roles as faculty and federal researcher. He has important roots in Maine since he did his undergraduate degree at Bates in biology and chemistry and a PhD at UMass Amherst. One of the things that everybody has to publish papers from their PhD or else kind of your career doesn't go very far. But not everybody who publishes who finishes a PhD very quickly gets their story into a book by John McPhee, one of my favorite nonfiction writers, and in one of my favorite books by him, Founding Fish, on page 100, actually. I just double-checked that this wasn't all a big dream in my head. Joe's in there for the work that he did for his PhD on salt tolerance in shad. So, to make me even more upset, then, of course, last fall, at the beginning of this semester, we had Murray Carpenter here, who's a wonderful freelance writer in Maine. And in a great story he wrote about the Penobscot restoration, Joe was the very first character in that article that he wrote in last October. So Joe is doing a lot better than me at getting picked up by great writers and getting out to the popular media. I've been impressed with Joe's long before I had the pleasure of beginning to work with him, just impressed by the students and postdocs and collaborators that he worked with. He's done everything from physiological ecology to structured decision-making to Bayesian hierarchical frameworks. He really spans this world of basic and applied research and management. In fact, I have often thought that the way to think about this is that we probably need to blur the distinction between basic and applied, and I think Joe's work is an excellent example of that. More recently, he's expanded out to really be thinking about the policy issues here, all the way out in a project we have right now, looking at the FERC relicensing process together with Jessica Jansowitz and their student Sarah Vogel. So, and on the other hand, in the same project, working with Berlina Heers on issues about eel outmigration and the operation of dams. And in fact, that's how I really had the great opportunity to work with Joe. As we thought there was an opportunity to write a $6 million grant to the National Science Foundation that we ended up calling The Future of Dams. And I thought I would just tell a quick story about this because I don't think I've ever mentioned it to Joe. So this is a cool project. It has 6 institutions, 20 faculty from just about every possible field, all the way out into the arts and the humanities, because one of the partners is the Rhode Island School of Design, University of Rhode Island, University of New Hampshire. Something like 20 faculty, 20 graduate students, 2 postdocs, including Sam Roy here in the front. But we were all 20 faculty were working on this proposal at once, which I don't recommend for those of you to emulate. But at some point in the last probably few hours, all the things were coming together to get loaded up onto Fastlane. And one of my close colleagues, Kevin Gardner, who's an environmental engineer at University of New Hampshire, he was watching all this come together because they actually hit the submit button rather than us. And all of a sudden he realized that some of these CVs were way stronger than others. And he said, "Who's this guy in Maine that published 20 papers in 2 years?" And I forget which years, maybe 2014, 15. But anyway, never a bad thing with an important proposal to have very strong colleagues on it. So, Joe, I'm not saying that's the only thing that got us the grant, but thank you very much. And please welcome Joe.
Well, thank you very much for coming today. It's certainly my pleasure to be here, and I was very flattered when invited to give a talk here. It's certainly always point of interest to see how an introduction from David goes, and so he does not fail in that aspect. So I'm going to talk about dams and fish today. The title is pretty wide open, and that came from trimming things down that were a little bit more complex to really just trying to plumb what are the potential interactions with impoundments and fish, and trying to look through a lot of different perspectives from that today, some familiar, some not so much. But before I go any further, I think it's really important, I put myself on the front page there, and this is not a complete, but I think a representative sample of some of the folks that I'll be drawing from who have really done all the hard work that I'm going to be skimming all the good stuff off of today. And if there's one thing that I feel I've done well over the decade and a half that I've been here, it's been able to find good young colleagues to work with as we go. So the usual cast of characters, I think, where we've seen a number of talks on campus about migratory fish include things as attractive from the top left as a sea lamprey, Atlantic salmon, sure end up somewhere sometimes, short-nosed sturgeon in the bottom, and certainly the middle we have river herring. That's because we have a hard time identifying blueback herring and alewife. We usually lump them together. And of course, probably the best fish, as David was alluding to, American shad. And I'm going to pull some stories from all of these guys today. But I'd like to really highlight the fact that when we look at the history of diadromous fish, these migratory fish along our coasts, we've seen centuries of declines over time. And one of the things that I'll draw from is from David Wilco's book, No Way Home, which I think is a great one if you haven't seen that. He highlights 4 different reasons why migratory animals have really met challenges through the recent times. And for fish along the coast, it's the same way. And I can highlight the same in terms of habitat destruction, certainly looking at overexploitation for many fisheries. Climate change being a third, and in no particular order, but I'll end up with today's topic, which is human-created obstacles. And so when we take a look at human-created obstacles, in waterways, very often that takes the form of dams. But let's think about this a little bit more critically for a minute. Just in a general sense, fish and other organisms have places where they're reared at a young stage, and places very often that's different, where they're occupying as an adult. And that migration quarter, that movement quarter, is critical. And rivers really serve that function for organisms that are coming in from the ocean, or in case of eels, going out to the ocean to spawn. When we look at construction of dams over the last century or so, we see that this has really increased after World War II, where if we look at this, you can certainly see the early 50s as a highlight of our ability to put impoundments in rivers. Now, these are numbers that can be confounded by the size of the impoundments and whether or not we're looking at small head dams or large head dams or hydropower. But suffice it to say that the period after World War II was certainly a period of activity. And there are some very conspicuous examples of those blockages. Certainly the Colorado River. When I heard about this for the first time, and I'm still amazed to even think about the ability to add an impoundment and stop a river from actually reaching the ocean in any meaningful way. And the entire ecosystem that was supported in that estuary basically being extirpated. Certainly there's a number of species that are still struggling. But we can look at it a different way too. In recent years, there has been this activity of dam removal that has been on the rise. And if we look into the recent years from the 80s on, certainly dam removal has come up. And certainly David alluded to the Future of Dams project, trying to understand what kind of strategic choices folks make about dams, their presence, their upkeep, and their environmental impact is part of that project, and certainly is of interest, particularly in Maine. if we look at Maine over the last couple decades, we can see from Kennebec, looking at the Edwards Dam to Fort Halifax Dam, closer to home. If we're looking at, and we'll look at a story from the Sajunkadunk today, and of course looking at great works in VZ dams on the Penobscot are key components of some of the work that I've been able to be a part of. But now, with that as a little bit of a backdrop, and because I'll draw some examples from the Penobscot River, I'm just going to linger on this. I'm guessing that there's a lot of familiarity, but all the same, I'll touch on it briefly so that when I talk about specific dams, we'll be talking about the same thing. So the Penobscot River watershed in Maine certainly drains a large area and is a complex of waterways that are impounded throughout the main stem. And the major ones I'm going to have highlighted here, and I'm going to add some color to those to identify what's happened recently to each. So if we look at the blue, looking at VZ and Great Works, these are two dams on the main stem river that have been removed. If we look at the Howland Dam here, that's a dam that there's been a natural or a nature-like fishway put into that section, that tributary, the Piscataquis. If you look at Milford Dam, Stillwater, and Orono dams, those are dams where there have been upregulation in terms of their hydro capacity. So the changes in the Penobscot River were a trade-off, choices between productivity of hydroelectric power as well as the environmental issues. So with that sort of as a brief backdrop, what I wanted to do is step back. The whole point of today's talk is to visit what I consider, I was looking for the 7 deadly sins, but I came up one shy. But just thinking about this, how do dams actually impact fish? And there's a number of ways. The first 3 here listed are pretty familiar to folks. The last 3 maybe not so much. And by no means are these going to be exhaustive in terms of examples, but certainly a smattering of different ways that impoundments can affect fish. And so we're going to talk about access, injury, delay, shifts in demography, shifts in the community, and finally looking at how different ecological services might be shifted with impoundments. So with that, let's talk about access. This is the one that I think is most easily picked up by folks because some of the examples are so very conspicuous. And I mentioned that we were going to talk about the Sajunkadunk Dam, and here it is. This is work from Rob Hogg, who was really looking at sea lamprey and their expansion, as well as Corey Gardner, who was a grad student with Steve Coughlin and myself. And to orient you, this is the dam at the end of the Sajunkadunk. You can see here, that's where that dam is located. And this is a depiction on that map of sea lamprey nests. So sea lamprey is one of the most fantastic creatures. They come in, they spawn and die, and even though they look like snakes, or as many people mistake them for them, or eels, they're actually a very primitive fish that in a lot of ways serve a lot of the ecological functions that salmon do. And so you go and you take that dam out, and what happens? Well, probably not a surprise to anybody. Those fish find habitat upstream and use it. So again, pretty simple. If you unbuild it, they will come. Another example of this in the Penobscot, where the VZ Dam was in place and had active fish passage, but for several decades, passage at that dam did not include any meaningful numbers of American shad, and so only a few dozen had passed, and then through incidental captures and through other observations, namely folks going out and fishing for them, said, geez, there's a lot of fish down below. And we went ahead and mounted this expensive camera at the mouth of VZ Dam to see what was approaching. And so what we saw, seeing 2 clips here, of course these are cherry-picked. On the left you can see a couple of Atlantic salmon coming through. This is a Didson, so it looks like a sonogram. in the Atlantic salmon are on the left, and on the right you can see these schools of fish that are about the size of American shad. So by going through, measuring these fish, we were able to go and get an idea of what kind of encounters of fish we see approaching the VZ Dam. And lo and behold, it was pretty interesting that even though passage numbers would have indicated those fish were absent, in fact, that's how they were toted, that there were no American shad in the river, that more than 3/4 of the observations below that dam were American shad. And so that was a case where the dam is blocking access. Working on short-nosed sturgeon, this is a project that's led by Gail Zydlewski and Mike Kennison, and occasionally I get to go out and play. Looking at trying to understand the use of space in the river by short-nosed sturgeon ends up being one of the potential really good news stories in the Penobscot, where the removal of the two lowermost dams restores all of what's presumed to be their historic habitat, and Matt Altenritter is shown on the right there. What I do want to point out is using acoustic telemetry here, and I'm going to just orient you. Here's date. You can see tracks from a fish at different parts of the river over time, and what you see is where the VZ Dam was, and first observations, these were reported with great pride by Catherine Johnston, who saw these movements of fish up into areas that they had not accessed for probably hundreds of years. So another example, again, access is a pretty easy one to understand. Alewife, or river herring, end up being another very, very impressive critter that shows up into our rivers, and they show up in numbers that are just absolutely amazing. Picture shown here of some river herring, as well as a close-up of absolutely beautiful fish. And come May, if you get a chance to go out and visit some of the rivers, it's one of those moments, Discovery Channel moments. But the St. Croix is a great example, and Betsy Barra has been working on this on the St. Croix River, where policy and the biology of these fish have come head to head. And it's pretty interesting. Just in a brief story, there's a series of dams starting from the ocean up, and those dams are owned by Canada and then successively by the US. And what had happened over time, as I show you in a graphic of the population for these alewife, here on log scale, just keep that in mind, in year across the x-axis, what you see is that early on this graph, there's this huge increase in the population of alewife. Again, for those who are interested in restoration, this is a positive thing. But 2.5 million fish made people take notice. At the same time, people made notice of the fact that smallmouth bass fishing had seen some bumps. Not noted was that there were certain drawdowns in the spawning areas for these fish at the same time. And so dams were closed. Again, we're talking about access here. Dams were closed. What happened? Well, the fish population responded appropriately and declined. And up to the point where Canada was left scratching their heads and saying, okay, we're going to start trucking these fish around to keep the population going. And only recently were these two dams opened up. So one other thing that I won't go into any detail on, just as a last point in terms of access, impoundments can shift the environment as well in ways, particularly in estuaries, that can limit access. The holy trinity here, temperature, oxygen, and salinity, can be very, very important in limiting where different species can access. Okay, so the second one, injury and death. Again, this is one that I think folks generally have a good idea of and have seen pictures and such that do this some justice. When we look at why we have dams, very often hydroelectric generation is part of that message. And those, in a general sense, you have some sort of ponded water, it goes through a turbine. And these are turbans are fairly large, but if you think about the relative size of many of the fish that have the potential of going through, there can be some mismatches in the probability of going through successfully. So turban strikes can and do occur for fish of all shapes and sizes. And so that is an important aspect of trying to manage hydroelectric power generation in the context of fish passage. So one of the things that has been an extensive effort, and this has included a number of folks, including Mike Kinnison, in terms of trying to characterize smolt survival in the Penobscot River. We've studied, this is the natural state of Atlantic salmon for right now, being stocked out. We've used acoustic telemetry pretty heavily to try to characterize the survival of this juvenile stage going out to the ocean. So these are fish that are reared in a hatchery and generally put out as a juvenile that's migrant to go directly out to the ocean. So we can assume if they don't make it to the ocean that they have succumbed, and because that's a critical phase of their life history. And so to do that, as I mentioned, we've used acoustic telemetry. If you're not familiar with that, you put in these little pingers and you put out these receivers at different spots through the river, and these listening devices allow you to pick up when these fish are going by. And I won't dwell on this, but it's good just to think about how the data are processed here for a minute. If we look at this really idealized situation where you have a release of fish, have a couple of detection areas, and have a dam in between. I should have waited for the arrows, but that's all right. There's the detections. And if you just go through the mental exercise of releasing 1,100 fish and following them down, and let's say you picked up 1,000 of them above the dam and you picked up 900 below, one of the things you could do is just say, well, 90% of the fish made it through the dam, but the problem is that your detection efficiency is not always perfect. And so because of that, you could be underestimating the survival. In other words, if you look at the little red dots, and I love this animation perhaps too much, you can go through and each one can either get detected at all, get missed by one, get missed by the other, or even get missed by both. And so being able to account for those potential misses is something that gets dealt with in CJS, or Cormac Jolly Sieber model. In this really basic example, you have a couple survival estimates, you have a couple detection efficiency estimates, and that last section is one that you can't really deal with because you're unable to resolve those two probabilities. But now think about that model on steroids when we look at the product for the entire river. And this is more than a decade worth of work that was put together by Dan Stitch and made this map that indicated areas of high mortality or survival. And this is one of those things. Green is good, red is bad, and probably not a surprise to anybody since we're talking about dams and fish. The dams are the areas of the hot spots where we see lower survival. So again, we see mortality associated with dams. Now, one of the things to realize is that, again, all injuries are not immediate, so you don't end up necessarily just with half a fish or a dead fish. What you can end up with, because these fish are riding a maybe not so gentle way downstream, is that they can end up with injuries that are not immediately lethal. And so something like a descaling injury is very common for folks who are trapping Atlantic salmon at screw traps. The scales during that phase of their life history are called deciduous. You handle them and they come off very easily. And that can be important because they're not like a dragon where the scales are put on these outside and you can just pluck them off. That's actually their skin that goes over the scales. They're part of the living skin. And so when you look at these injuries, they can result in poor seawater tolerance. And this is a project that I worked on with Gail Zydlewski now on what seems like 1,000,000 years ago, where we took those fish with different injuries and put them in saltwater. Remember, this is the phase where these fish are going seaward and going from freshwater into saltwater. And a lot of things have to happen in order for them to successfully do so. Without getting into the physiology here, when we put them in salt water, if we look at the blue line, you expect to see if they're doing well, to see no change. But what happens is that deviation from maintaining their internal salt level is where they failed. And for those fish that have relatively minor scaling injuries, they end up not doing so well in terms of performance. That's linked to things like swimming performance and predator evasion, which might be important for a fish going through the estuary. The last one in terms of the trio that I expect people to really intuitively think about are delays in migration. So if we're looking at tagging Atlantic salmon, this is a gastric tag, and I think that's George's head there that you can see. George and Lisa Izzo spent a lot of time looking at the migration of adult Atlantic salmon through the lower river. And on the picture to the right, you can see the antenna coming out from the fish that's been tagged. And so we can use that together with a sort of a cruel joke that gets played on these fish. They get captured at Milford Dam and then displaced back downstream and asked to do it all over again. And so that allows us, though, to go and say, all right, well, let's look at points of interest. For example, where the old dams were, or where the confluence of the still water is, there's flow coming in. Do they get distracted there? And then finally, as they approach Milford Dam, now the lowermost dam in that river, how well do they perform with that ascent? So this is a graphic that shows track from one fish. This is by no means a non-representative fish. And here's river kilometers, so going upstream is up along the y-axis, date further along on the x-axis. And what you can see is that this fish went ahead, paused here over the course of a day or two to make it up to Milford Dam. But then it took a long time for that fish to finally be captured at Milford Dam. So much so that, in fact, the time that before the restoration that Atlantic salmon would spend going from Vesey Dam to above Milford is about the same. There hasn't been a gain in terms of speed. If we look at upstream progress, this is just putting the data together. If we look at where those fish pass through open reaches, again from downstream to up here, we're looking at Vesey, an open river section, still water, and so on. And you just compare the relative speeds here on the x-axis, where all of these indicating a much faster migration speed than those that are in that short reach that includes Milford Dam. We can see that for the smolt phase too. So again, we're dealing with salmon here. We can look at the area from freshwater to the estuary here, movement rate on the y-axis here, and you can look at those areas where the dams are present. They slow them down. And so, okay, dams slow them down. Is this really important? Well, I mentioned one of the potential risks for sublethal issues, but certainly there's some wildlife out in the estuary that has something to say about whether or not a fish makes it out to the ocean in a timely manner. In this, it's not a particularly good picture, but this is above the Howland Dam. If you drive past there anytime when the fish are migrating, you're going to see more cormorants than you can shake a stick at. And there's a reason they're there. The fish are holed up. It's the same sort of thing. If you want to think about where you're going to encounter people on the road when you're driving on a highway, even though your progress might be at the same speed, you're going to see people at stoplights. You're going to go through, but that's where you're going to see the most people. Why is that important for smolts? I'm going to linger on this one for a minute because this is near and dear to my heart in terms of the par-smolt transformation that gets that fish from freshwater out to the ocean. And this is work done by Randy Spencer, where he took some fish, put them into these annular tanks, again, cruel jokes that we do to fish, right? Where they were, pit tagged and have two antennas, so we can tell whether or not a fish is going upstream, in quotes, or downstream, and then plot that. In this over the period of time that these fish smolt in May, and is plotted with movements either going downstream, the appropriate direction up, or upstream on the lower side. And what you can see is that there's a general increase over time in their migratory behavior, but then it decreases again. This is important because for migratory animals, there's a window of opportunity for behavior, for physiology, and also importantly in terms of the ecological consequences for the timing of their migration. And so for a smolt that might have a 2 to 3 week window of opportunity to make it out to the ocean, delays of a few days or even a week or more can be important. And this is where I'll go and draw some of the work from Alejandro, who has been working on the Piscataquis River, releasing fish and tracking them downstream. Let me orient you for a moment here. We have time to passage here, and these are just the different dams, and there's 2 years of data shown here. But what I do want to point out is that this one dam on the Piscataquis River has a pretty serious delay associated with it. And just keep that in mind when I show you a simple graph in the next plot here of how that delay can play out. If we go and we look at the overall survival associated with the fish that have either passed a dam and been delayed, or just passed the dam or not had to pass that dam. Again, this isn't associated with any direct injury from that dam. We can look at survival for more of a control of free-flowing reach for 2 releases, or we can look at a comparison of how they fare at the next downstream dam. So again, just to clarify that, the fish that had to pass a dam upstream had subsequently lower survival at the next downstream dam. And a lot of these fish that passed here were delayed up to 2 or more weeks. So now we're going to shift a little bit to a shift in demography. So the first 3 that we talked about are access, right, injury, and delays. Those are things that we think pretty intuitively about in terms of how impoundments can have an effect. Shifts in demography, not so much. And I'm going to draw first on an example that has nothing to do with impoundments, but certainly highlights a migratory fish. This is work from Meg Begley, who has worked on suckers and looked at commercial take. And so looking at these 2 columns, there's a column of lakes that have been heavily fished and those that haven't. And what you can see is when we look at age distribution, which is along the x-axis, and frequency on the y for all of these, that the ages for those populations that have been fished have been shifted to the left. They're dominated by younger fish. That makes total sense, right? If there's a persistent risk for each year that you're out in a lake, you're going to eventually, your number is going to come up and you'll get drawn in the lottery and no longer be in that population. So I want you to think about that sort of risk in the same way as the marginal risk of a fish passing a dam, that it can be one of those things that that probability of survival can have an added up effect. And so we'll go back to American shad as an example here. I mentioned that American shad in the Penobscot River are restricted, really, up until the last years, were restricted down below VZ Dam. So there's a population of fish that didn't have to pass upstream or didn't have to pass downstream. Now these are guys that are very interesting because in our northern latitudes, they don't need to spawn once and die like you'd think about salmon on the west coast. They can go back to the ocean, recondition, and come and do it again. In fact, many of the fish that we've tagged have spawned 2, 3, and even 4 times. And so all that is a preamble just to say that when we look at the age classes that we see in the Penobscot River, we see this dominated by 5, 6, and 7, even 8 and 9-year-old fish. And so when you think about that, this is a unique opportunity. Here's a population that hasn't had the impact of the impoundments. Now, Dan Stitch has done some great work working on trying to model populations and look at the potential impact of passage. Now again, for an adult, you need to not only get upstream, but you need an exit strategy, right? And so think about that now when we look at a biplot here, looking at upstream passage and downstream passage, and as usual, green is good. So green is a higher proportion of individuals that reach an older age class. Here we're just looking at age 6. And so the first thing to think about is the far left. If you look at it, if you don't have upstream passage, it doesn't really matter how your downstream passage is, because nobody got upstream to suffer any downstream mortality, right? And so if you just look at that, you can see that in those cases, when you have no upstream passage, you would expect to see a greater probability of these older fish. What's interesting when you look at this biplot is that when you look at that lower right-hand side, where you have upstream passage being fairly high, you need to get to a point where downstream passage is particularly high before you can maintain the age structure that you've seen. I want to linger on that just for a moment, that it doesn't matter in terms of trying to preserve the age structure if you get the fish into habitat and you can't get them out safely in terms of maintaining your population dynamics. Now, if only there were a place where we could look and see where we might see those kind of results. The Connecticut River, just to our south a little ways, has historically had fairly large population runs, and in the late 40s to 50s established improved passage at Holyoke Dam, now their first main stem dam. And when you go and you look at their population, you end up seeing the age distribution really dominated by 4s and 5s. And so, as you might expect, you see associated with more impoundments a cropping off of the age structure and a loss of those later aged fish. Now, why is that important? For American shad, for other fish, size and fecundity go hand in hand. In fact, there's lots of cases where larger, older fish, those that have spawned repeatedly, actually are producing fish that are eggs that are of a higher quality. And so by losing those fish that might contribute the most fit individuals, you're actually doing a disservice to the population. And I've used salmon here as a diagram. This is some work that is done by George Maynard, who has been putting together some of the pit tag telemetry work from the last decade or more in the Penobscot River as well. So just really briefly, fish that are captured at the dams get injected with this. It's a 12.5 millimeter tag. It's RFID. It's the thing that you go and when you beep at Home Depot, it's that problem, or you pit tag your cat. So for all the dams in the Penobscot historically, we've had pit tag antennas set up so we can get an idea of those fish that approach a dam and those fish that successfully pass. And then you can ask some pretty interesting questions about that. And all of that work synthesized into one graph is shown here. If we just look at the probability of Atlantic salmon passing based on size. So again, probability of success on the y-axis, fork length on the x. And what you see is that for smaller fish, there's a higher probability of successful passage versus larger fish. Now, what does that mean when you look at it in the field? It means that if we have gone and released fish at the first dam, and then taken a look at their successive success upstream, we look at a release. You get there's a fish on an average that are 68.5 centimeters fork length. And if you go and you look at who actually successfully passed the next 2 dams, you can see a pretty strong selection against the larger fish there. And I'll highlight here that for Atlantic salmon, it's not like there's a lot of prime spawning habitat up between Vesey and Milford Dam, the stretch that these fish were released into. So, 2 more to go. Shifts in community. One of the things that I'll highlight here is not on this continent, but Abdullah Berry did some work on the Sele Rocal River in Sierra Leone, and while we're talking about removing dams, much of the world is actually hitting their heyday in terms of building, particularly in Africa and Asia. And this is a dam, actually, ironically, I had the opportunity to visit many, many moons ago, but it was finally built in 2009, and data were collected ahead of that as well as following it. And in a real simple way, we can compare the communities before and after by using different indices of similarities. Here's one shown, and just really zero in on this area where the impoundment was built. This is pre, this is post, and what you can see is that if we look at the similarity between the sites that straddle that, they were more similar beforehand and less similar after. And what happened is that whole community shifted from one that was much more diverse, not only in species number, but in terms of different ecological forms, and became dominated by cichlids, which has some positives in terms of protein sources, but certainly some negatives in terms of the ecological impact on that system. Closer back to home now, Jonathan Watson and Ian Kyrali have done a tremendous job looking at the community structure changes in the Penobscot River, and if you caught his talk there last week, I won't go and repeat the whole thing, but really briefly, if we look at the community through the area where the two major dams have been removed on the Penobscot River, we can go and take a look at how things have changed in terms of species distribution. And just going to give you two quick examples here, really briefly to orient you to the graph. Here we're looking upstream and downstream, pre on the left, post on the right. The dams are indicated by the black lines, and you can see their position on the river there. And what's being plotted is the actual number of fish per kilometer of shoreline as a metric. And the long and the short to take away from this is that there's winners and losers. You take out dams and the fish that are migratory, here we're looking at river herring and American shad, become more distributed through the areas where they didn't previously have access. There's also losers. The habitat has shifted, and if you're a golden shiner, life has become a little harder for you and you're not doing quite so well. So again, not trying to put values on these, but largely that there are really distinct changes in the habitat that result in changes in the communities. The last thing that we're going to talk about are abatement of ecological services. And this is something that catches a few different topics here, and I'll try and just touch on them briefly. First, we're back to our lovely sea lamprey here. These guys I've mentioned, they're semmelparous. They come into fresh water and spawn as adults. They've resorbed their digestive system, so they are just spawning machines. After they build nests and spawn, the young are actually in the gravel, and they stay there as filter feeders for many years before they migrate back out to the ocean. But right now, what I want you to do is notice that these guys are working awfully hard, moving a lot of rocks around. And if you look at this, in the stream, you can identify where these nests are built. And these have real consequences for the nature of the substrate in that stream. I will just draw back and realize that there's folks from Trout Unlimited and such who organize people to go out into streams with rakes to go and loosen up the cobble and such for the fish that really matter, right? The trout species, so that they can spawn in the fall. And these guys come in the spring, do this as part of their own nature, and then importantly, if we look to the right, where we can see the output for the mound, the pit, in a reference site associated with that nest, you see a reduction in fines, and we could measure fines, we could measure embeddedness. All of these things are affected by getting in there and mixing up the gravel. So sea lamprey by cutting them off from different areas, that seasonal loosening up of the gravel is one of the things that gets lost. Another thing that I'll touch on is one of transfer of nutrients between different habitats. So I've talked about freshwater habitat, the connectivity with the ocean, but also recognizing that there's transport between the land, freshwater, and the marine environments. And a great example of that, again, is still going to be with the sea lamprey, but I'm going to introduce a tool that maybe, if you're not familiar with, it's fairly intuitive to look at a graphic and think of it this way. It's a biplot where we're looking at the stable isotopes of nitrogen on the y-axis and carbon on the x-axis. And in general, what you see is that freshwater values tend to be lower left, and more marine values tend to be upper right. Those distinctions allow us to go and look at the transport of nutrients and infer movement throughout a food web. And so this is work from Dan Weaver, where went out and put some sea lamprey carcasses out and put some aniseeds out as well, and then tried to track them over time to see whether or not there was an uptake of those nutrients. As I pointed out, and as you probably is indicated by the fact that I tucked these symbols far to the left, is that the reference site here in the carcasses start out on the lower left, more of a freshwater signal. But after a couple weeks, while the reference stays in that mix, those fish that have been exposed to those carcasses end up being pushed closer to the marine signature. And so this is, again, just inferential that nutrients coming in from the ocean are getting taken up by members of the ecosystem in the freshwater habitat. And you think about this, in general, our freshwater habitat in this region is fairly nutrient poor. So a seasonal influx of nutrients can, at a time when the temperatures are just rising and spring just starting to come out, can end up being fairly substantive. It also can affect other species. Again, many times we look at these functions and put them in the context of species that people might care a little bit more about. And so this is the magnificent Atlantic salmon at a 1-inch stage here. And if they're exposed to carcasses, or at least in this case, in reality they're carcass analogs, what ends up happening is that their growth rates get affected. This is work by Margaret Guyette, who exposed fish to either no addition or an addition, and it's really probably not a lot of surprise. Fish mass for those fish that were exposed increased such that if you look at these, and these are representative fish, the fish that were exposed to the nutrients ended up growing faster than those that were in the sad sac stream that got no nutrients. Why is that important? Every year that a fish has to spend in a habitat before it makes a transition is a year where there's an additional risk of mortality. And so subtle gains in growth scope can have very profound changes in the overall population dynamics. This is one of those things, this is not from around here, and I totally stole the video here, but if you haven't seen freshwater mussels that produce from their mantle a lure, they've spawned and they have now the larvae, the Glaucidia larvae, that are ready to be released. And they produce these really elaborate lures to bring fish into an area so that they can basically blast them with their progeny, and then they get stuck onto their gills. This is gills from a fish where the Glaucidia larvae are attached to. This is one of the functions where many species have very close ties to different freshwater mussel species, and particularly in looking at migratory fish, the ability to move and to transport these end up being critical components of the long-term survival for some of these mussel species. 2 more to go. One of the things that was a real surprise to me in looking at this is that there's a number of human diseases that have been indirectly impacted by the construction of impoundments. And schistosomiasis is one of those diseases that has had such an effect. And this is not new. Just to get to the source here, this is from the 70s. These kind of interactions have been well characterized, and their causes have been pretty well characterized too. So if you're not familiar, schistosomiasis is a trematode, a fluke, which ends up burrowing into the skin and lives in either the digestive or the urinary tract of the unsuspecting human host. And then after putting the eggs back into the water by either urinating or defecating in the water, those end up living for a little while in a snail host before they go and have their asexual form that can reinfect. Where do fish come in? Well, these little guys, these snails that are the host, ended up being the point of predation for a number of migratory fishes. But when you put an impoundment in the way, you get this cascading effect where fewer of the snails are eaten and more of the flukes are then managed within those snails, and rates of infection can go up. Just for a moment, in a dam show, how many times could you expect to see a coyote eating a sheep? One of the last things we'll talk about is the idea that predation can be affected by the presence or absence of other members of the community. And so one of the best cases where prey buffering has been demonstrated is actually looking at carnivores and eating domestic animals. And so if we're looking at the coyote predation on lambs, on sheep, is directly tied to the overall biomass for native animals. And so this balance back and forth of a very human associated issue ends up being linked to the native community of mammals. And so these guys don't pass dams, but these guys do. And one of the things that a number of folks, particularly from NOAA, have been very much on the forefront of trying to explore is this idea that many of the migratory fishes that are either moving out, as these are juveniles going downstream, or adults coming in, overlap with other species. And by virtue of that overlap, the overall relative risk to a species that might be fewer in number is mediated. So with that, I'll revisit the overall idea. The thought was here to go and visit 6 topics that are associated with the impacts of dams. 3 that are pretty easily understood, certainly access, injury and death, and delay. But the 3 on the tail end here, I think, are things that I haven't spent as much time thinking about as potentially I could have. Shifts in demography, certainly shifts in community, and how those complex changes to the ecosystem and those ecosystem services might be shifted with impoundments, I think is a growing field and one that could be easily explored. So thanks a lot for your time.
You talked a lot about salmon and shad and alewives coming up the rivers after the dams were removed. I was just wondering if you had anything to say about the population of striped bass that are now coming up all the way to the Milford Dam.
Yeah, I think one of the things I would say is that striped bass have eluded me all too much in too many ways, both personally and professionally on different years. They've been very variable, and most of them within the Penobscot have been younger age classes, though you certainly see some older fish. Historically, there are reports of large striped bass being observed as far up as Millinocket. So I think there's probably greater historical connectivity, and there's a potential within rivers to have overwintering populations, though I would be hard-pressed to say that's the case in the Penobscot for sure. Most for the, I think I've ended up tagging probably 20 or 30 fish, and all of them have left the system in October, as you might expect from a migrant.
So, thinking about the outcomes of recent dam removals and so on, one of the sort of intuitive things is thinking of, in terms of restoration, that things should come back to a state pre-dams. But given your perspective of these multiple different effects in the history of dams, is that the sort of rational target for restoration, or should we expect these systems to come back as different but functioning things?
Yeah, I think this is. I'm smiling because Jonathan probably spent a good 20 or 30 minutes in his defense last week while we were having just this discussion. I think the whole idea of baselines is a very useful policy prop, but is not a very realistic one in so many ways. When we look at the Penobscot River or any other one, the bird fauna have changed. Certainly the presence of smallmouth bass in the Penobscot is one of the most conspicuous changes to the community. And certainly, when we're going ahead and making any inferences about the ability of different migratory species to come back, where I've made a point particularly for salmon that they're sensitive physiologically to different aspects, the whole topic of climate change comes up. I'll add one more, and that is in the estuary, the overall shifts in productivity in the way estuaries, and probably in the Penobscot, but definitely in many other rivers, the degree to which the estuary has been an area of high productivity and for juvenile residents has shifted. It's certainly on the west coast when you look at the Columbia River, that whole lower section, lower 100 kilometers or so, is now a gamut to run through rather than a place of rearing. So, the question, as well is sort of a leading one in that the entire community has shifted, the entire environment has shifted, and I think the idea of returning to a point is ill-founded, not only because that's changed, but because there's general oscillation even in a, quote, stable situation. So,
Joe, for shad, you show a possible age structure change going to the dams.
yes.
But one would expect a lot of young fish, younger age classes for X number of years, because of increased spawning, I would assume, upriver. How long would it take for that to stabilize to a point where you can really assess the effect of the dam?
Sure, and just to be clear, when I'm talking about downstream passage in that particular simulation, that's downstream passage for adults. So the reality is, if you're an adult and you access habitat and there's a penalty to be paid, that your probability of spawning next year has gone down. And so that, I think, is, I'm guessing that you're talking about juvenile immigration, where if you're mathematically, and Betsy is working on some simulations for alewife, you can readily outstrip what is the theoretical threshold you need for complete saturation. But then there's a question of downstream survival, and that's a whole nother dynamic. But I think overall, in terms of stabilizing, I would defer to the same kind of answer that I gave Mike, in that I expect a lot of environmental stochasticity, and age classes in fish are very highly driven by flow conditions as well as temperature. The year we had last one would have certainly shifted things around greatly.
Your last point about with the coyote and the sheep thing reminded me that people have been speculating for a while that these river herring could represent important prey for groundfish, cod, and the like, in the Bay of Fundy. And I've recently heard somebody speculating sort of the mirror image of that the plankton consumption by these herring could be problematic for plankton versus endangered whitebirds. Have you given any thought to it? I know I'm asking you to speculate here, but at the scale of the Bay of the Gulf of Maine, how important do you think seeing a few million more alewives, rivet herring is likely to be?
Wow. Let me skirt the question by giving you a couple thoughts, and that is that the outgoing anadromous runs are a small portion of those planktivores that would normally be on the waterscape, as it were. We certainly see other fish that have been fished down pretty heavily that would be having the same ecological impact, certainly Atlantic herring being among them. And so part of me would throw that out there. Then I would also say that, boy, there was a time when there were probably a lot of alewife and probably a lot of right whales. And so that would be another thought that comes to mind. I don't have a good answer for you because you can probably tell I'm reaching here. But the very fact that there's other species that could be having the same effect would make me think otherwise.
Wonderful slides. I
Thanks.
found your slide interesting about the kind of history of when dams, were built and very popular. When I was growing up a long time ago, in the 50s, in the Midwest, what we did for every vacation was get into a car and go and see some dam that was being
Oh, neat.
And my engineering dad said, this is the best thing that's ever happened to America. So it's very interesting to see sort of that there was no kind of understanding of some of the possible consequences, just that this was just a miracle and a wonderful thing to see these great big huge dams on the Colorado River and whatnot being built. So it's very interesting.
Well, thanks. And one of the things I'm usually pretty careful to say is that, there's a difference between understanding things and having a value judgment associated with them. The fact that there are these outcomes does not mean that building a dam is a good or a bad decision, right? It's a good or a bad decision based on what criteria or what are your objectives. And this is one of the challenges that we have in terms of fish passage, right? We're in a world that is readily outstripped its carrying capacity. And, if we're looking at climate change scenarios, which is better or worse? I don't know. These are the bad choices. Is it better to lose populations of fish and not put the carbon in the atmosphere by drilling more oil wells? These are the trade-offs that folks have to deal with. And, that's the fodder for a lot of good conversations, as well as, I think, for some of the directions that a number of regulatory conversations center in on.
One last one. Who owns Brownville, and is it hydropower? And is it target, given what you showed on Port Passage, is it a target for the agencies now to work with the owners on that? 3 questions.
3 questions. I can remember them. Kruger owns it. It is a hydroelectric facility. And one correction, though, perhaps interestingly and annoyingly at the same time, survival past that dam was near perfect in the last year. It was just that those fish were delayed. They survived that dam, then incurred higher mortality downstream. So I think Piscataquis has to be an important reach for passage for regulators, largely because some of the best habitat for Atlantic salmon is up past that reach.
On all your data that you're gathering, specifically Lower Penobscot, specifically with mortality discussions, are you folks gleaning methyl mercury levels out of any of these regions?
I have not. There are some folks who are associated with some of the Haltrachem work that's been going on, and I think there's maybe somebody in in the room who might know more than I, but no, I'm not involved in any of the methylmercury work. One more?
Hi, Joe. It's Eric.
Yeah,
See you.
same here.
Has there been any work done on genetic diversity before and after, I guess, building the dam, or even taking one out?
For the Penobscot, I'm going to say no in one capacity. Certainly for Atlantic salmon, the genetic attributes have been tracked, but that's because largely it's a stocked and ranched run in the Penobscot. As far as alewife, one of the things that I heard was that, boy, an alewife's an alewife's an alewife when active stocking took place. There are some folks who have looked at structure through New England and such and seen some genetic structure on alewife, as well as shad, both of which had some level of structure in spite of the level of movement of fish between rivers. But to your question in terms of before and after dam removal, I'm not aware of any, but I would point you in the direction of this gentleman in front to follow up on that later on. Thank you.